Thank you, Aku. And I should thank all those who have ensured that I should be given such a warm welcome on arriving here in very cold Helsinki. I should say it's the first time I visited your city, and it is proving a very pleasant experience. So thank you, and a special thank you to Aku, who issued the invitation for me to come. Some of you may recognize that portrait of the great 17th century scientist Galileo. A few years ago, I was invited to give a lecture in the University of Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I was asked by the BBC if after the lecture I would mind being interviewed. This was at the time when the Troubles, as they were called, were at their height. There was terrorist activity and a lot of tension between Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland. I said I'd be very happy to be interviewed, particularly if they concentrated on the history of science, which was my speciality. But I certainly did not wish to be asked politically sensitive questions at that very difficult time. Oh, sure, they said, no problem at all. We will respect that. So I arrived at the studio, and the first question I was asked was, did I think Protestants or Catholics had made the greater contribution to science? That, it seems, was not a partisan or politically sensitive question. But I tell you that story only because it was what the interviewer then went on to say that made me realize something wasn't quite right. Because he said, we all know, he said, that Galileo was sent to jail for believing that the earth is round. Now, I hope you all know that there are two myths or falsehoods in that statement. If you don't, see me afterwards. There are many myths about science and religion in popular accounts of the history of science. For example, here are just a few examples. Medieval Christians taught that the earth was flat. Or the scientific revolution of the 17th century liberated science from religion. Or from the 19th century, evolution destroyed Darwin's faith in Christianity. There are so many of these myths that Ron Numbers and a few of his friends decided it would be good to produce a book in which some of these very common misunderstandings were exposed. And that was the origin of the book Galileo Goes to Jail and other myths about science and religion. And as a friend of Ron and a contributor to that book, I'm absolutely delighted that it has just been translated into Finnish. And I understand that during the course of the afternoon, this book will appear, and that you can buy it, and that you should buy it, because it is a very good read. Each chapter, and there are 25, I know there are 25 myths because I was going to say I wrote myth number 25. I exposed myth number 25, which is that science is the principal cause of secularization. But the point is, each of the chapters in that book are only 3,000 words. You can read them in 20 minutes. Just the thing to read before going to bed or before going to sleep. You can explode a myth every night for 25 nights. So I heartily recommend the book. Among the myths that are expounded and then exploded in that book is the idea that Christianity uniquely gave birth to modern science. There's a discussion of the myth that Einstein believed in a personal God. But there are other popular misconceptions that are also corrected. The idea that the medieval Christian church suppressed the growth of science and prohibited human dissection, for example, very common but erroneous belief. The idea that Copernicus humbled and demoted humans when he removed us from the center of the cosmos. Another well-known myth that Thomas Henry Huxley, on the right there, defeated the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, in their debate over evolution in 1860. I imagine many of you have heard of this story, but some perhaps haven't. So let me just say that what happened was that the Bishop of Oxford, who had some scientific education, decided that he would score a point against the Darwinians by asking Huxley whether he would prefer to be descended from an ape on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side. To which Huxley allegedly rubbed his hands with glee and said, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." And he promptly said that he would rather have an ape for an ancestor than a bishop. Or, perhaps not quite so explicitly, but he would rather have an ape for an ancestor than a man who used his position and privilege in the church to pronounce on matters he knew very little about. And the myth is that Wilberforce Huxley so humiliated Wilberforce that this was the decisive battle in a long warfare between science and religion. It's a myth because even Huxley's son, Leonard Huxley, said the notion that my father, Thomas, defeated the bishop is a nonsense. By far the majority of the people in the audience would have sided with the bishop. So the story, as one hears it, is greatly exaggerated. Now, as I say, the myth I was asked to expose is number 25, the last one in the book. And it's the common belief that in Western cultures, modern science has been the main cause of secularization. This is how the anthropologist Anthony Wallace put it in 1966. Belief in supernatural powers is doomed to die out all over the world as a result of the increasing adequacy and diffusion of scientific knowledge. 40 years after Wallace made that prediction, in November 2006, a new Centre for Inquiry held its inaugural press conference in Washington, D.C. Its aim, and I quote, was to promote and defend reason, science, and freedom of inquiry in all areas of human endeavour. And the reason this was deemed necessary was because, and I again quote, because of the resurgence of fundamentalist religions across the nation and their alliance with political ideological movements to block science. Very prominent scientists signed a declaration deploring the persistence of paranormal and occult beliefs and a retreat into mysticism. That prediction of Wallace had simply not come true. The contention of those scientists was that public policies should be shaped by secular values and that science and secularism are inextricably linked. Well, we have a definitional problem, of course. What do we mean by secularization? And I think for most people, this is a process in which one is referring to the displacement of religious authority and control by civic powers that simply take over the functions formerly fulfilled by religious institutions. But the word secularization can also mean the loss of beliefs characteristic of specific religious traditions. A report in the Times newspaper in England recently stated that 1 in 5 Britons is now an atheist, as a generational shift away from religion gathers force. And the word secularization could easily be applied to that. The word generational is used there because apparently 1 in 3 youngsters, according to a very recent survey, 1 in 3 youngsters under the age of 24 declare themselves atheists, compared with only 1 in 10 over the age of 60. It's an interesting trend. Now that's in Britain, but we're immediately face to face with problems of context and not merely problems of definition. For example, in the United States, the latest figures suggest that only 5% of Americans are willing to declare themselves atheists. As the Times newspaper reporter observes, Americans would be astonished to hear that only 10% of British atheists feel uncomfortable telling people their identity. Within Europe, too, there have been different degrees and patterns of secularization in different countries, making it extremely difficult to generalize about the causes. Let's begin, though, with some of the reasons why science has been given a high profile in discussions of secularization. As with many myths, the proposition that science causes or brings about secularization does contain elements of truth. For example, the earliest enduring scientific societies, the Royal Society of London and the Academy of Sciences in Paris, both had a policy of excluding religious discourse from their proceedings. That was in the 1660s. In the 17th century, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that the origins of religious belief lay in the fear and ignorance of nature's forces. If he was right, then as knowledge replaced ignorance, superstition would surely recede. Where scientific explanation remained incomplete, religious thinkers would plug the gaps with their gods, but further scientific advance repeatedly embarrassed such a god of the gaps. That's the common view. We also know that the content of scientific theories has sometimes clashed with conventional readings of sacred text. If we just go back to with Galileo, with whom I began, this was true of theories of the Earth's motion in Galileo's day, which embarrassed a literal reading of some Old Testament texts, particularly in the book of Joshua, where Joshua commands the sun to stand still, and it does. And why would Joshua have commanded the sun to stand still if it was standing still already? That was the issue. Or again, a similar kind of question. In the 19th century, the theory of evolution challenged a literal reading of the Genesis creation narratives. Now, are these not examples of science providing resources for secularization? the introduction of Western education, philosophy and technology in 19th century India, just to switch the geographical focus for a moment, had consequences that have been described as a massive and thoroughgoing secularization. And if further evidence were needed within a different cultural tradition, again, in Judaism, many eminent scientists of the 20th century presented themselves as, and I quote, non-Jewish Jews. An interesting expression of the secular life of the Jew. But there is the question, and the question is whether these elements of truth that I've just been picking out constitute the whole truth. Is it possible, perhaps, that the science causes secularization formula has largely escaped criticism, partly because of its usefulness? And I'm thinking of its usefulness to those who wish to promote science and who wish to suppress religion. And in the rest of this talk, I want to argue that the relationship between scientific progress and the secularization of society is complicated. There's plenty of historical evidence to cast doubt on the claim that science and secularism are as inextricably linked as that new center of inquiry in the United States proposed in 2006. The association of scientific rationality with a secular mentality is commonly assumed by natural scientists, by social scientists too, many of whom welcome what they see as the corrosive effects on religion of rigorous empirical methods. But by contrast, many social scientists now reject what was once known as the secularization thesis. And this was the thesis that a continuous reduction of religious authority and function is irreversible in societies permeated by science and technology. Paradoxically, the urgency of that plea from the Office of the Center of Inquiry in Washington was more supportive of that social scientific perspective, that religious beliefs and practices may flourish and even regain allegiance in scientifically and technologically advanced societies. In controlling natural forces, science-based technologies have certainly far surpassed the results of prayer or meditation. And I think that is not a controversial statement. But their effects on religious practices have been strangely diverse. They have introduced new means of transport and recreation, which have provided seductive alternatives to the religious life. On the other hand, in large American churches, as I've witnessed myself with some astonishment, modern PowerPoint technologies have made church services more attractive and more embracing of the local population. And new technologies can also facilitate religious observance, as in some Jewish communities. On my first visit to Jerusalem, my wife and I were staying in a hotel, and we were on a floor about halfway up. And the elevator used to stop outside our door. We were a little bit unlucky in having a room adjacent to the lift shaft. But one night we were particularly struck because the lift was much noisier than usual. It stopped at every floor as it went up to the top. And so we asked the concierge at the hotel the next day what the explanation was. Oh, it's very simple. It's the Sabbath, and no work is allowed on the Sabbath. And so the elevator automatically stops at every floor so that people can exit and ingress without having to lift a finger. Pre-programmed ovens, you see, modern technology facilitating having a hot meal on the Sabbath, but not actually working on the Sabbath. And I find this very interesting because the technology is allowing the fulfillment of a religious imperative, admittedly in ways that to a Northern European Protestant may seem a little peculiar. There is the further complication that the form and even the content of scientific theories may reflect the values enshrined within a particular society as much as they may produce them. And I want to give you a couple of examples of this, because this is not science producing secularization, it's secularization facilitating secular science, and that's a very different kind of proposition. Towards the end of the 18th century, at the time of the revolution in France, secular attitudes were in the ascendant. And this was also the era when more radical scientific theories were taking shape, as in the cosmological theories of Laplace. Oh, sorry, I think we need to move on there. The cosmological theories of Laplace, there on the left, and in Lamarck's account of biological evolution. Lamarck's science was secular in the sense that all living forms became products of nature rather than works of the creator. And Laplace's science was secular science in the sense that he gave an account of the origins of the solar system without reference to a creator. Secular science, but already reflecting, I think, more secular trends within France at the time. My second example I found quite recently in an article by Michael Rechtenwald in the June 2013 issue of the British Journal for the History of Science. And the author of that article refers to the political radical George Holyoake. It's a name that I think probably won't be familiar to you. Actually, the name Holyoake is rather inappropriate to his particular philosophy, because he very self-consciously used the words secular, secularist, and secularism to describe the movement that he championed. And Rechtenwald, in this recent article, shows how Holyoake's form of secularism gained sufficient support to give encouragement to the scientific naturalists later in the 19th century, who based their scientific theories on naturalistic principles. Putting it very simply, secularism was not so much the product of naturalistic science as its precursor. Now, this suggests an important difference between what I like to call the secularization of science and secularization of societies by science. I see those as two different processes. For example, religious language had largely disappeared from technical scientific literature by the end of the 19th century. Not so long before that, it was still quite common to find references to the creator in scientific texts. You'll find the creator in Darwin's Origin of Species, for example. But this does not mean that religious beliefs were no longer to be found among scientists. the science may have been secularized, but religious beliefs were still very prominently held. Not always orthodoxly, but certainly they are there. And crucially, the cultural significance given to scientific discoveries and theories has depended on the preconceptions of those who are interpreting the cultural meaning of the science. So scientists with religious convictions have often found confirmation of their faith in the beauty and elegance of the mechanisms that their research uncovers. For the 17th century astronomer Johannes Kepler, the mathematical elegance of the laws describing planetary motion prompted his confession, and he wrote, "I have been carried away by unutterable rapture at the divine spectacle of heavenly harmony." It's a very interesting statement because the language graduates from the experience of an ordered, harmonious nature through to language about the divine and heavenly harmony. It's one expression of the view that when God made the world, he did so by number, weight, and measure. And that's a well-known medieval woodcut expressing that notion of God as the geometer, God as the mathematician. Or, staying with Kepler just for a moment, Kepler really did believe in the music of the heavens. The harmony is not just a metaphor. Each planet, according to Kepler, has its own melody as it orbits the sun. The faster it goes, the higher the pitch. The further away it is from the sun, when it's traveling most slowly, because it's an elliptical orbit, remember, the further from the sun, the lower the pitch. And Kepler has the beautiful idea that when God first made the world, the notes sung by all of the planets blended in the most perfect harmony that it was possible to create or imagine. So when we talk about science and the order of nature, the intelligibility of nature, the harmony of nature, we're talking about ideas that mediated between science and theology. We're not talking about science in opposition to a theological mentality. A far more modern example would be the former director of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, who spoke of his work as the unraveling of a God-given code. There's nothing in the science per se which entails a secular perspective. So instead of regarding science as the principal agent of secularization, I think it's more accurate to say that scientific theories are usually susceptible of both theistic and naturalistic readings. Historically, they've provided resources for both. Sometimes one and the same scientific concept has been manipulated to generate a sense either of the sacred or of the profane. And I'd just like to give you a couple of examples again. The concept of the atom, so fundamental to modern chemistry and physics, the concept of the atom was used in the 17th century, and indeed later, to argue for anti-religious, anti-providentialist readings of the natural world. And this was possible because in antiquity, there was a school of thought which ascribed the origins of the universe to the chance collision of atoms. Not even the gods, said Lucretius, could make something from nothing. But this atheistic creed was not entailed by an atomic theory of matter. A theistic interpretation was perfectly possible, as it was for Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton. Bacon found it inconceivable that a philosophy that so stressed the random motions and collisions of atoms could possibly account for the ordered world that we experience. In his essay of atheism, Bacon protested, "Even that school which is most accused of atheism doth most demonstrate religion. For it's 1,000 times more credible that 4 mutable elements and 1 immutable fifth essence, duly and eternally placed, need no God, than that an army of infinite small portions or seeds or atoms unplaced should have produced this order and beauty without a divine marshal." In other words, the atomic doctrine was actually more supportive of theism than was the prevailing Aristotelian system. That was Bacon's view. And actually, it's the view of somebody who was not an atomist himself, but he was trying to protect those who were from misplaced persecution or criticism. The second of my 2 examples here relates to what is arguably the most corrosive of all scientific theories. And this is, of course, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. For Richard Dawkins, Darwin first made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But it's easy to forget that among Darwin's earliest sympathizers in Britain were Christian clergymen, such as Charles Kingsley and Frederick Temple. Kingsley was a novelist who incorporates the idea of evolution into his novels, even into his stories for children. And it's been argued that Kingsley, more than Darwin, actually popularized the idea of evolution, though he doubtless would not have done so had it not been for Darwin, with whom he was on friendly terms. But Kingsley delighted Darwin by suggesting that a God who could make things make themselves was more admirable than a God who simply made things. It was an interesting little aphorism. Frederick Temple, who welcomed the extension of natural law in biology because he believed it then supported belief in the moral law, Temple was later to become Archbishop of Canterbury. So leading Anglican clergymen in England responded favourably to Darwin's theory. Although an agnostic late in life, Darwin denied that he had ever been an atheist. Just have Darwin late in life for a moment. And frequently referred to evolutionary outcomes as the result of laws impressed on the world by a creator. In his private correspondence, Darwin said it would be absurd to doubt that one could be a theist and also believe in evolution. It would be absurd to doubt that one couldn't hold both together. So instead of seeing science as necessarily secular in its implications, I think it's often more correct to see it as neutral with respect to questions, certainly questions concerning God's existence. And interestingly, that's how it was seen by Darwin's most vigorous popularizer, Thomas Henry Huxley. For Huxley, science, and I quote now, is neither Christian nor anti-Christian, but extra-Christian, meaning that it has a scope and autonomy independent of and beyond religious interests. Hence, Huxley insists that Darwin's theory has no more to do with theism than did the first book of Euclid, meaning that it had no bearing on the deeper question whether evolutionary processes themselves might have been seeded in an original design, a view that Huxley does not rule out. The pressing question then is not whether Darwin's theory has been used to justify unbelief. It has many, many times. But it's rather the need to understand the reasons for a person's unbelief, an unbelief that may then look to science for its justification. And this is a process I do see occurring through the pages of history. The main reasons Darwin gave for his unbelief helped to dispel the myth that it was his science that did the damage. Like other Victorian thinkers, Darwin reacted strongly against evangelical Christian preaching on heaven and hell. Members of his family had been free thinkers. His grandfather, Erasmus, had been an early advocate of organic evolution. His father, Robert Darwin, was probably an atheist, and Charles' brother Erasmus was certainly so. Interesting, Charles said of his father, he was the biggest man I ever saw. And I think you get a glimpse of that from that image. The doctrine that after death, members of his own family would suffer eternal damnation was, for Charles Darwin, a damnable doctrine. He was also sensitive to the extent of pain and suffering in the world, which he describes as one of the strongest arguments against belief in a beneficent deity. Each of these concerns was crystallized by deaths in his family, that of his father in the late 1840s, and of his 10-year-old daughter Annie, early in 1851. By all accounts, an angelic child. It's very difficult to come to terms with how a beneficent God could have in some way been responsible for her demise. Darwin did believe that as science advanced, appeals to the miraculous became more incredible. But his loss of faith, his original loss of faith, has deeper existential roots. And so the myth that I felt I was exposing in this chapter was the myth that science, more than any other factor, has been the agent of secularization. But you might say, well, how can you weigh these factors up? How can you say that other factors have weighed more heavily than the sciences? And of course you can't. You can only look at individual cases. But there have been attempts to do that. And the attempts that have been made seem to confirm that to give priority to science is a mistake. And the example I want to give you comes from a detailed investigation by the social historian Susan Budd into the reasons given by secularists in the UK in the period from 1850 to 1960. That's over a period of 110 years. The reasons they give for their conversion from Christianity to unbelief and secularism. Her sample in that survey is based on the testimony of 150 unbelievers with supporting evidence from 200 additional biographies. So not a trivially small group. And what she found, contrary to what she expected, was that references to science hardly featured at all in those accounts of deconversion. Conversions to unbelief were often associated with a change from conservative to more radical politics, with religion rejected when it was seen as part of established, privileged society. Then the reading of radical texts, such as Tom Paine's The Age of Reason, was another prominent influence, often mentioned by the secularists. Ironically, one of the frequently mentioned books was the Bible itself. Skeptics could draw attention to inconsistencies, absurdities, or particularly in the Old Testament, the depiction of a vengeful, anthropomorphic God with unattractive human characteristics. And in fact, Susan Budd discovered that in 1912, the president of the National Secular Society in Britain warned that biblical stories of lust, adultery, incest, and unnatural vice were enough to raise blushes in a brothel. The fact that every Christian sect, indeed every religion, claimed its own hotline to the truth was another consideration, which had nothing to do with science. The perceived immorality of religious doctrines, particularly concerning an afterlife, and the perceived immoral behavior of some priests also fueled a rejection of religious authority, as it does, of course, today. Then the argument that atheists could be as morally upright as believers also took its toll. Historical, more than scientific research was proving subversive, as the biblical writers were seen not as timeless authorities, but as unreliable products of their own culture. Those are some of the reasons Susan Budd found were prominent in the accounts given by secular thinkers of their own disenchantment with Christian theology. The distinguished anthropologist Mary Douglas observed some years ago that those who imagine science to be the main cause of secularization forget that religious activity is grounded in social relations and not primarily in concepts of nature. Consequently, if she was right, it's wiser to look to long-term changes in social structure and to changes in religion itself if we want to understand the momentum of secularity. In the mid-19th century, when the idea of conflict between science and religion first caught the public eye, the changes that most provoked secular reaction came from within both Protestant and Catholic Christianity. Claims that there were no errors in Scripture could easily lead to an unattractive bibliolatry. Similarly, claims that the Pope was infallible on matters of faith and doctrine, and that the Catholic Church was entitled to assert its authority over the teachings of science. Those two precepts antagonized many people. Among them was John William Draper. Draper published a book in 1874 called A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. It was an immensely influential thesis. It was the sort of Richard Dawkins' God delusion of its day. And its thesis was that Catholic Christianity had been a mortal enemy of science, not just in the present, but also in the past. Earlier, the intolerance of dissenters shown by religious organizations had provoked criticism during the Enlightenment, especially in France, where Voltaire's quarrel with the Catholic Church was primarily on moral and political grounds. As Voltaire recognized, Newton's science actually supported theism rather than atheism, and it continued to do so. That's just the frontispiece to the translation of Newton's Principia into French. In modern times, the expansion of secularism can be correlated with social, political, and economic transformations that have little direct connection with science, though doubtless indirect connections can be found. Historians point to increases in social and geographical mobility, changes that have led to the disintegration of communities once bound together by common religious values. And we do have detailed case studies that support this emphasis on the social. There was a fairly recent investigation into the reduction of religious activity on a particular Danish island, and the author of that study was led to the conclusion that the reduction of religious activity was not due to an encounter with scientific knowledge or with scientific methods. It was rather due to a transformation of social relations associated with the mechanization of agriculture. And that had reduced village populations and it had weakened social bonds. For John Evans, the author of this study, the problem with the conventional secularization paradigm is that it defines religion as a method of explaining the physical world through the supernatural. And if you think about it, that is precisely how Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett do tend to define and treat religion, an explanatory enterprise basing its explanations on the supernatural. On the contrary, writes Evans, it's explaining the social world, giving it meaning and moral value, which is religion's primary concern. Or as the critic Terry Eagleton has so nicely put it, to regard religion as failed science is like regarding a ballet dance as a failed attempt to run for a bus. And just to give you a mental image, I picked that one out. So if science has not been the main agent of secularization, what then has been? Very rich question, very difficult question, to which the answer is immensely complicated. In his fine book, A Secular Age, Charles Taylor examines the change, and I quote now, from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. And this is a change that could only come about through the presence of serious alternatives to Christian monotheism. For Taylor, the most important of these alternatives can be traced back to the early 18th century with the development of what he calls an exclusive or self-sufficient humanism. And this, in his understanding, is a humanism that accepted no final goals in human life beyond human flourishing, and no allegiance to anything else beyond that flourishing. And this has to be understood as a new moral sensibility, certainly not primarily, as a response to the physical sciences. In fact, Taylor issues the same warning that we have already met. To make scientific progress the driving force of secularism is to conflate religious beliefs with explanatory hypotheses when this is not their main function. And I actually like Taylor's analysis because he distinguishes clearly between the original reasons for a loss of belief and the reasons that an individual might subsequently give to justify their skeptical position. For Taylor, appeals to science belong more to the justification than the motivation of unbelief. For the motivation, the more powerful influence has surely been the wretched consequences of religious warfare, rivalry, strife, and intolerance. And we hardly need reminding of that today. During the middle years of the 17th century, at the time of the English civil wars, the natural philosopher and chemist Robert Boyle warned that if a man were to come to London, he would be in danger of losing his faith. I understand this is still true today. There were so many competing Puritan sects, each claiming its own hotline to God. Just a few years earlier, Francis Bacon had declared that the greatest threat to religion came not from science, but from religion. It was a diagnosis that has been expressed in many different ways in European culture. During the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, they're looking very grand, David Hume attacked religious authority with his argument that every religion had its own set of miracles. This therefore meant that those of one religion simply cancelled out those of another. There have, of course, been many other forces that have made secularization possible. The growth of capitalism, commerce, and consumerism has fostered a pervasive hedonism, threatening commitment to religious institutions and their long-term goals. Religious worship has been marginalized by competing attractions. Secular values have been heavily promoted in the sphere of education and by the media. In some countries, religious solidarity has been displaced by national solidarity or by the ideology of political parties. The fact that such transformations have taken place at different rates and to different degrees in different cultures means, as one sociologist of religion has recently concluded, I'm thinking here of David Martin, Martin concludes, there is no consistent relation between the degree of scientific advance and a reduced profile of religious influence, belief, and practice. Because different countries and different cultures have experienced the tension between secular and religious values in contrasting ways, there is no one universal process of secularization that can be ascribed to science or to any other factor. The freedom in the United States to believe more or less anything from a large smorgasbord of ideas, ideals, and therapies. That contrasts sharply with the repressive constraints at work in societies such as the former East Germany. Under a communist regime, such freedom of expression was denied. Interestingly, where nations with a long religious tradition have been oppressed by a foreign power, their religion has often reinforced a sense of national identity, bursting out of its chains with a new vitality on gaining freedom. And the strength of Catholicism in Poland in recent times would be a modern example. With the end of the Cold War, an old union of faith and nation was reignited. A history of secularization in France would be very different from its history in the United States, where centralizing tendencies of all kinds have been resisted. In another twist to the story, aggressive, anti-religious remarks made by prominent scientists frequently elicit a strong religious reaction from those who find in their religious practice a meaning and an orientation for their lives that scientific knowledge alone seems unable to provide. To this extent, and others have noticed this, a figure like Richard Dawkins is sometimes his own worst enemy, that it's almost a case of shooting oneself in the foot by being so aggressive towards religious communities. Undoubtedly, you can connect science to secularization if you wish, and you can do it very easily by definition. If you look at the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, if you'll forgive a little bit of propaganda for my home university, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, you'll find that it defines secular to mean the world, especially as opposed to the church. It's not a very good definition, because as opposed to can mean in opposition to, or it can simply mean in English by contrast with, which is not the same at all. So it's not a very good definition, but notice the connection with science then becomes almost necessary, because scientists do devote themselves to the study of this world, its history and its operations. But this oversimplification, I think, is not really to be sanctioned. If you make scientists secularists by definition, it seems to exclude what is palpably obvious to any historian of science, that many of the greatest scientists from the past have found it possible to harmonize their faith with their science. Many have not been orthodox in their tradition, and that does need to be said. But predictions made long ago that future scientific progress would banish religion now seem naive. Just before the First World War, a survey was conducted by the psychologist James Luber, in which 1,000 American scientists were asked whether they believed in a personal God to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving an answer. The percentage subscribing to that belief was 41.8. You might find that quite a high figure. Luber predicted that with the advance of science, the proportion would shrink. When the results of an identical survey were reported in the journal Nature in 1998, the percentage was almost identical, 39.3. The predictions, again, had turned out to be false. Now, there is evidence, and this is important, there is evidence of a higher degree of religious skepticism among the most eminent scientists. And there is a perception, certainly from these surveys, that there are relatively few theists among biologists. It's a good question to explore why the different sciences should be differentiated in that respect. But survey results suggest that they should. But those data reported in Nature do qualify the claim that science necessarily leads to secularization. That claim, I still believe, is a myth, and it's fostered largely by those who wish to invest their science with excessive cultural significance. Thank you very much.